Looking back on the week that was and forward to the week ahead. It's the Fantasy Football Hustle. Here are your hosts, Brian Drake and Dwayne McFarland.
All across the fantasy universe. Welcome one and all to the Fantasy Football Hustle, powered by Pro Football Focus. I am, of course, your host, Brian Drake. Follow me on Twitter at Drake Fantasy. Be sure to check me out Sunday, 7 to 9 p.m. Eastern, as I host PFF Postgame on SiriusXM Fantasy Sports Radio. And, folks, we're already here. It's week 6. Can you believe it? And before you get sad that the season's blazing by too fast and you have to wait till next year to draft new teams, well, think again. Our pals over at Underdog Fantasy have rolled out Best Ball Ressurection, a new best ball tournament that costs just $10 to enter and runs weeks 6 to 17. Use promo code HUSTLE when you sign up. We're going to double your initial deposit up to $100. It's a kick-ass way to get drafting again. Don't miss out. You can do it all weekend long before the games kick off. Promo code HUSTLE. Where today, everybody, I'm so happy to welcome a guy I found on Twitter, and I've really enjoyed his data-driven takes. And if that's your thing, and likely it is if you're listening to this show, you'll dig today's show. So from all the way across the pond in England, we're so happy to bring on Tom Strachan of Football Outsiders. Give him a follow on Twitter at NFL_T-Strock. That is TSTRACK. Tom, welcome to the Hustle, buddy.
Thanks for having me on. Like I was just saying before we got started, really big fan of what you and Dwayne do. Really like it. It appeals much to me because, like yourselves, love that kind of data-driven side. Love best ball. Love fantasy football. So, it's all the right boxes ticked.
I like it too, is because and everybody who listens to the show know, Dwayne's got his gig now with Matthew Berry at Fantasy Life. Make sure you're checking out the utilization report over there and at PFF. So he's kind of hit or miss when I can get him on the show, but you sort of look like him with the glasses and the beard. So some people will trick a few people today and they'll be like, it's just Drake again. Damn it.
It's just the accents that's going to give me away.
Let me first start there. So you're over in England. We know that the NFL is doing their London games, and there's actually a Germany game coming up in Munich in a few weeks. What is the feel of the NFL over in the UK? Are there a lot of fans of specific teams? Are they general fans? Is it transplants? Like, how big is the game over there?
So I first kind of got into the NFL probably sort of like around 2007, 2008. And back then it wasn't incredibly popular. Like I went to my first NFL game at Wembley was the Saints versus the Chargers in like 2009. And then it was quite easy to get tickets for the games. Now when the games go on sale, they sell out in minutes, and it's really difficult to get them. Over here, like you go to those games or you go to a bar on Sunday nights, and now the NFL is on Sunday nights. It used to be that you'd walk into a bar and there'd be some European soccer on or something like that. But now there's so much popularity behind the NFL that it just seems you can walk into a sports bar anywhere and you'll be able to watch the NFL. And I mean, I just know so many people who are into it over here. Last year, this summer, we had our first UK fantasy football convention, which was organized in London. And it was about 100 people bought tickets for it. And the game's just really growing. There's so many incredibly intelligent people who are a fan of it over here. And I think it's just going to go from strength to strength.
That's awesome. I know I talked to my buddies at the 5 Yard Rush, and I know they're in the UK. They tell me it's just growing. People are learning the game. Who's your team? I see you got a Ravens jersey behind you.
Yeah, I'm a Ravens fan. I mean, for me, back when I got into the NFL, like particularly when you first try to get into the NFL, if you come to it from a place where you try to learn the rules yourself, for me, the defense of most teams wasn't that, it was kind of boring. But when you saw Ed Reed and Ray Lewis flying around the teams, that was like, okay, this is it for me. So I've been a Ravens fan ever since.
How did you turn? I mean, you're just finding the NFL in the past, 10 years or so. And now all of a sudden you're writing for a great site like Football Outsiders. How did that come about?
Yeah, I'm kind of like obsessive with things, it's not like I used to be big into Fantasy Premier League and play an awful lot of that. Fantasy Premier League is like just complete peasant's game compared to Fantasy NFL. Like for me, when a friend said, you should come play in our Fantasy NFL League, we try to go from 8 players to 12, and I turn up on draft day and it was just like this is incredible. This is what fantasy sports should be about. And then, of course, like the COVID lockdowns hit, and I work in television on my day job, and nothing was being made. So I had a few months of sitting at home, and it was just like, okay, well, I'll just join another league. I'll join another league, and got chatting to more and more people. And Rich Cooling from 5 Yard Dynasty, and some of the guys from Fantasy Wildcard who were all British. I got talking to them and started becoming friends with them. And then it just sort of snowballed. I started writing about DFS a couple of years ago, and from there just progressed on to writing more and more about best ball to where it is today. I just take it one day at a time and enjoy it as much as possible and obsess over stats as much as possible whenever I can.
Well, that seems to be a lot of guys in our fan base. They dig the stats and they want to get an edge on their competition. And I was reading your stuff on Twitter, and that's when I reached out. I saw your takeaways from week 5, and you can read. He has a breakdown of a takeaway from every team over at Football Outsiders. So, check them out, at FB Outsiders on Twitter, and you can find a link to it there. So that's what I want to do with you today, is kind of focus on some of these key takeaways on some of the teams that are, catching my attention, and the nuggets that our friends want to know about across the fantasy universe, as I like to say. So, Tom, let's start in Pittsburgh, where Naji Harris is making fantasy managers pull their hair out. The line stinks. The quarterback was switched. And now the running back that we all drafted in the first round, because he gets all the touches, is running like he's stuck in the mud. And we've got UDFA Jalen Warren stealing his touches, albeit in a blowout last week. But the writing here seems kind of on the wall. Warren is showing juice on a team that is 30th in the league in rushing yards after contact. So that's mostly on Naji Harris. Harris is currently RB 27. He's averaging a putrid 10.3 PPR points per game. So let me ask you, what is going on in Pittsburgh? How can we spin this for fantasy managers now who have buys coming up? And it's almost unthinkable to say, well, I drafted Naji Harris in the first round, but now I want to sit him on my bench. He's playing the Bucs this Sunday. You can't sit him on your bench.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult position. And it's very much like whenever you've got a first round player who isn't performing, it's always that weekly battle that you face of, can I bench him? I feel like I want to bench him. And if you do bench him, is he suddenly going to put in like 30 points? We saw Derrick Henry in week 3, a week after having a miserable performance against the Bills, suddenly went off like 25 points. But I think the problem with Harris is, we spent a lot of people spent the offseason saying anything's going to be better than Big Ben. And the reality is, when you've got Mitch Trubisky there and Kenny Pickett, defenses aren't giving them perhaps as much respect as they used to give Big Ben. With Big Ben, you knew that he could get the ball out so quickly that you had to account for that in the way that the defense was lining up. But now it's, you've got a very hit and miss quarterback situation, regardless of which one of those players is under center. And we've seen Naji Harris's, last year, even if you remove the crazy 19 target game that he was getting 4.6 targets a game. Now he's down to 3.0. His total touches have dropped from 22.4 down to 16.4. And that's the 17th, that's the 17th highest amount amongst running backs. So if you're drafting a player at the 110, 111, you need them to be getting either the very highest amount of those, or you need them to be incredibly efficient on them. And he's just doing neither of it at the minute. He ranks 36 in running back success on Football Outsiders. And I think in Dynasty, I think you kind of have to sit and hold and wait for a big blow-up week and then see if you can sell on the back of that. In redraft, I think you just have to kind of take it each week, because you probably built your roster counting on him to be an every week starter.
Yeah, I know I've added Jalen Warren everywhere, and I keep preaching that to people. Not that I think the Steelers are going to all of a sudden just turn the backfield over to this kid. I mean, they did draft Naji Harris, super high just a year ago. It's not like he's some old, decrepit running back. Yeah. What is the kid, like 24 years old?
I think the same age as Josh Jacobs, isn't he? So it's very similar.
Yeah, we'll get into him. But it's... it's one of those things where you just want to have Warren around, because I don't think still Naji Harris is healthy. And this happens every year where you have a player and then they underperform. And then in the offseason, these reports leak out like, this guy was dealing with a foot problem all year, which we know Harris has. Or this guy's got a shoulder problem or whatever the problem is. And I really do think that's the case here with Naji Harris. I think the foot's bothering him. He's playing through it. And who knows, maybe at some point in this team kind of stinks, they shut him down. or they just say, let's give him a few weeks off and just let's see what the kid Warren has. But if Warren gets in, I know the line sucks, but he's got so much juice. I'm excited to see him get in and play a full complement of downs.
And he's actually, what's really kind of been surprising is for an undrafted free agent or like late round rookie pick, you don't expect them to be particularly good in pass protection. But over the last few weeks, he's looked really good in that facet of the game. So I think it's going to be very hard for them to stop playing him. And it's going to be very hard for Naji to get back to that 3-down role. And yeah, I think it's he's looking like probably one of the biggest busts of the first round at the minute.
So Kenny Pickett takes over, and he's a little more athletic, let's be honest, than Mitch Trubisky. He's got his favorites, though. He's throwing the ball like it's his job, well, because it is, to George Pickens, the rookie wide receiver here. I just quickly want your thoughts on Pickett, what he can do for this offense, and what do you see from George Pickens going forward? Because I've seen people out there saying, hey, this kid, rest of season, is going to be a top 20 wide receiver. I've made that claim in the past. Or do you think, it's going to be hit or miss and Deontay Johnson's still the guy to own here?
Yeah, I mean, I love Deontay Johnson. He's somebody that I've got a ton of across best ball and across dynasty. And I think that Deontay Johnson's ceiling is very high, but I think at the minute you're probably going to have to wait for those kind of ceiling performances to come through, because at the minute it's just all going to Pickens. I mean, we saw him go from averaging 1.6 receptions per game under Mitch Trubisky to 6 receptions per game over the last 6 quarters with Pickett. He's gone from averaging 21.6 yards up to 92.5. So, that's a huge boom. I think, over those last 2 weeks, Pickens has been a top 24 wide receiver. So it's not outlandish to say that he could carry on that form. I do think as he puts in more solid performances, he is going to see more focused attention from defenses, because particularly over the first few weeks, he even said that it felt like he was just out there doing wind sprints. So I think for now you have to plug Pickens in as an every week play. I think you have to plug Deontay Johnson in because of the draft capital you probably invested in him. I think Claypool is a much harder start at the minute. He seems to be the guy who's just hoovering up what's left. But maybe if Pat Freiermuth misses this week, I think he left the game with concussion, was it last week? So perhaps he's okay. But I think Pickett's going to have a very much a rookie year. It's going to be one of those where there are weeks where he's usable and he delivers well, but then there are going to be very tough weeks. And I'm not sure against Tampa Bay that I'd expect him to have a great week.
I love what you say there about Claypool. I'm not a Claypool guy at all, but we are going to see Pat Freiermuth with his third concussion in 2 years. So I got a feeling he's got to get shut down. You can't keep running this guy out here. He's a detriment to his own health. Let's relax on him. So Zach Gentry, if you're in a super, super deep, maybe tight end premium league, you're looking to pick him up. But yeah, maybe they get some more snaps for Claypool. Let's stick in the AFC North, where Jamar Chase is another first rounder who's not really living up to expectations. Last season, through 5 weeks, Chase was a rookie, remember, who averaged 19.5 PPR points per game, and he was wide receiver 8, again, through the first 5 weeks. Fast forward to this year, through the first 5 weeks, he's wide receiver 13, which is fine, but his points per game is down 4 points per game from last year's opening 5 weeks. So over the last 4 weeks, Jamar Chase has not finished better than wide receiver 29 in PPR. But the numbers seem all to be there, Tom. Air yards, routes, targets, all the good stuff we always talk about here on The Hustle. What do you think's going on with Chase and the Bengals? Is he kind of a buy, sell, hold? What the hell's going on in Cincinnati?
I think you've got to hold. I mean, if you trade him away in Dynasty right now, you won't get that kind of level like Justin Jefferson, whereas before the season, they were kind of viewed in the same tier. So I'm definitely holding. The good thing is, they are peppering him with those targets. I mean, against the Ravens on Sunday night, I think it was like 2 of the first 3 passes went to Jamar Chase. But it just seems like it's not really the high value stuff isn't there. So even though he's getting in the touches, a lot of them are really close to the line of scrimmage. So like his yards per route's fallen down to 2.8, which last year I think it was 3.4. And out of the last 3 games, he's had 18 receptions, but only 6 of those have turned into plays greater than 10 yards, because it just seems like the offense as a whole just isn't cooking right. There seems to be problems with everything, really. Like, the running game's not performing well. The running game got going against the Ravens, but then everything went wrong for Jamar Chase. And yes, there were times where they were double teaming him, but that's just something you've got to deal with as one of the best wide receivers in the league. I think, last year in defense adjusted yards above replacement, Chase ranked 6th. At the minute, he's ranking 47th. And, his yards per target's down to 4.2. It was 11.4 last year. Every stat you look at, it's like volume's still coming, and he's clearly a part of the, he's doing things right, but he's just not been able to turn it into big plays. And I'd like to believe positive regression is going to come for Jamar Chase at some point.
Yeah, this is a team that's top 7 in the NFL in dropbacks per game, but they're 20th in drives that end in actual touchdowns. So they're not scoring. And we know in fantasy football, and Jamar Chase benefited a lot from this last year. You'd see him make these kind of circus catches down the field and get into the end zone. When you don't score, now a lot of warts start bubbling up to the surface here. Now, T. Higgins might not play this week. He's got an ankle injury. We got to watch him. That could either mean more targets for Chase, or it could mean now he's getting triple coverage out there. I quickly wanted to ask you about Joe Mixon. He's everyone's buy low. If you look at any article out there, who do you buy low right now? Joe Mixon heads the list. Talented guy. We thought they upgraded the offensive line, but it seems to be kind of the same old song and dance in Cincinnati. He is seeing a little more work in the pass game, which is encouraging. They're not taking him out like in the Super Bowl. It's Samaje Perine.
Yeah.
But it just seems like, Mixon's, I don't know. It's not coming together for him yet either.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I mean, like before the game against the Ravens, he had some really putrid numbers. I mean, like, and then both him and Samaje Perine were able to run all over the Ravens, who were missing their nose tackle, Michael Pierce, who's now out for the season. But like his yards per carry jumped from 2.6 up to 5.6 in that game. And it's like, is that because the Ravens were shorthanded, or is that because things have started to click for him? Like, across the league, Mixon leads running backs in rushes inside the 10-yard line with 15, but he's only got 1 touchdown. Like 10 of those even came inside the 5-yard line, where he's averaging 1.6 yards per carry. So it's quite concerning that he's not been able to get into the red zone, like into the end zone there. But also, as you mentioned, like the targets, like he's on for a career high in targets, I think. But there's been 2 weeks where they've been over 7, and then 3 of them where they've dropped out like 3 or 4 a week. So it's like, we really need the 7 to be more consistent than the 3 or 4s, because they can easily just not add up to the huge kind of fantasy days that we'd like. So I do think Mixon's kind of somebody that I'm fine holding. I wouldn't be in a rush to push him away. I think fantasy pros have the Bengals with the 12th easiest strength of schedule against the run for the rest. So yeah, I'm kind of okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Mixon's still PPR running back 15, so it's not like he's the worst thing in the world. You drafted him likely end of the first or early second round to get him on your roster.
Who would you rather have for the rest of the season, Mixon or Naji?
Joe Mixon.
in
much better team,
yeah.
Better opportunity. It's a good question. I'm sure there's some people out there that are throwing that trade around to see who they can get to bite. It's a small sample size with Joe Mixon, and it's a small sample size with a lot of players out there. It seems like in the off season, when fantasy, Twitter can really sit down and do some investigating on these players. And one of the things that always comes is, that's a small sample size. This is a small sample size. He's only played X amount of games. Well, we like to go overboard now with players. Like, we've only seen 5 games through Joe Mixon, and people are ready to jump off a bridge. We've only seen 5 games with Geno Smith, who are ready to put him in the Hall of Fame. And Josh Jacobs, who now is, like we just talked about a second ago, he looks outstanding because he's getting all the usage. But this season's long. You got to let things play out, because we know injuries happen. I saw Josh Jacobs get up already favoring that shoulder in his game on Sunday. Joe Mixon in that line can figure it out. Geno Smith could turn back into Geno Smith. So what do you think about Geno? I know this is kind of off the cuff, but do you think things like this stick around? Because a year ago, we were telling people who were like 0-4, trade Josh Allen. You got Sam Darnold. Just play Sam Darnold all year. He's great. And then, guess what? Sam Darnold stinks.
Yeah, I think with Geno, it's one of those ones where it's like, you get through week one and you're like, oh, okay, Geno, some of his passing stats were really impressive, like completions over expected, EPA per drop back and stuff. And then, but it's probably a bit of a misnomer. And then they were playing the Broncos, and it was a big game against Russell Wilson. And then the weeks keep ticking on, and you're like, okay, well, I mean, the season is a long season, but we're almost a third of the way through the fantasy season at the same time. And Geno Smith's weekly finishes have included like 3 inside the top 8. It's like, I think it's a very difficult player to start because, like you say, it would be very easy to see Geno all of a sudden just poop the bed and sort of like really regress. I mean, yesterday, Pete Carroll was saying that Drew Lock's nipping at the heels of Geno Smith, which just seems crazy. So I don't know. I think I'm kind of fine in Superflex, plugging Geno in as your QB2. I think if you're in redraft and if you drafted somebody like Justin Fields, who's been just dismal at times, or Trevor Lawrence, who's been very up and down, then I definitely get the argument of starting Geno. I think if you took anybody inside the top sort of 6, 7, 8, then you're probably fine and don't have to worry about sort of problems like this.
Yeah, I know there's people out there who maybe their team is struggling a little bit. You got Justin Herbert, or maybe you had Dak as your quarterback, and you're like, well, I got Geno. Maybe I can trade my stud quarterback for some other pieces. I'm always wary of that because to me it's like that old regression to the mean. It's like, well, there's a reason these guys are sort of middling players, and you're going to trade away, your super stud quarterback and say, oh, well, I could get a lot for Lamar Jackson, and I've got Geno on the bench, but I'd rather trade Geno away.
Yeah, I think it's just very easy for things to start going wrong. Like Geno's average is like in clean pocket completion at the minute is like 81% or something around there. And it's like, it's very, the 2 tackles are playing both really well for the Seahawks, but it doesn't take a lot. If one of those goes down, does all of a sudden Geno's confidence start to get a little shakier? Does he start getting the ball out at the wrong time? So, I mean, I'm never trading stud quarterbacks away in any leagues. It's just, they're too valuable.
No, I hear you. Talking with our buddy Tom Strachan. You can follow him over at Football Outsiders. Make sure you're following him on Twitter at NFL_T_Strack. How's Twitter treating you these days?
It's good. I mean, it's one of those where you've always got to be wary about winding up the wrong fan base. But yeah, I mean, basically my kind of Mondays and Tuesdays are spent diving in all of the details from the weekend, throwing out stats out there with the odd snide remark and seeing how it goes.
That's a crazy place, man. It really is. Another crazy place is Florida these days. So we hope everybody down there is doing okay. If you're a fan of the hustle, you're listening in Florida after the hurricane, we're thinking of you. But in the NFL, Jacksonville, we were all blown away the first few weeks by James Robinson. Looked incredible out there coming off his Achilles injury. Now we're seeing back-to-back weeks where Travis Etienne is out snapping James Robinson. But I also know, as an Eagles fan, Doug Peterson's going to employ multiple backs here. So I don't ever think this is going to become just one man's backfield. So Tom, was Etienne's shift, was it just game script dependent? Because the last 2 weeks, the Jags were losing for the most part of those games. And per Dwayne's utilization report, Etienne owns a 65% snap share when the Jags trail by 4 or more points.
I think that's a big part of it. And before the game against your Eagles, the Jags had kind of been cruising. They were, everybody was kind of pleasantly surprised by how well they were doing. And so against the Eagles, it was very much a case of they needed Etienne as that kind of third down. They needed him as that sort of like hurry up offense running back. And then against the Texans, it seemed more like that the Jags were going to rotate. And Etienne, I think it was during the first quarter, he had 2 runs, one for 18 yards and then one for 30 yards on back-to-back plays. And then for the rest of the game, there was still quite a bit of rotation going on. And Etienne only had one run over 3 yards for the rest of the game. So whilst he did have those 2 explosive runs, it wasn't like he was being consistently brilliant throughout the game. And we've seen, James Robinson had a stinker last week and was averaging like 2.7 yards per carry. But we've seen James Robinson be really good consistently through the start of the season, showed some great bursts and some great breakaway runs. They play Indy this week, who have the second best rushing defense in DVOA, whereas Indy rank 21st against running backs in the receiving game. So this week might be shaping up to be more of another Travis Etienne week. And then, next week after that, we play the Giants, who rank 21st in rush defense. So maybe that one ping pongs back and it's back to James Robinson. So I think, with the bye week starting, you probably have to take a bit of a gamble and be willing to start either of them, depending on the state of your running back room. And I don't hate the matchups for either of them, really. I think, Indy will be tough, but we've seen James Robinson be good against tough defenses before.
I know personally I'm starting Travis Etienne in a couple of leagues where I've got Dameon Pierce on a bye, or I've got an injury to somebody like Naji Harris. At the wide receiver group in Jacksonville, Christian Kirk, he is wide receiver 20 in PPR, had a terrible week 5, but he smoked these Colts in week 1. And last week, I just want to think it's, they spread the ball around a lot in Jacksonville. They paid Kirk a ton of dough, and they want him to sort of be the focal point of this offense. But, these weeks are going to happen in fantasy football. Are you buying or selling Christian Kirk for the rest of the season?
Yeah, I'm buying. I think last week, like you said, it was a stinker, like 11 yards on 3 targets, just isn't going to get it done. Against the Eagles the week before, he'd struggled, and he had like 9 targets, but only turned it into 2 catches, but he still got 60 yards, and you can live with that, like 8 PPR points. That's, that's not great. That's not what we're after, but it's not a killer week like last week's kind of 4 points. I think if you remove last week from it, I don't know. I don't know whether it was a case where they were just aggressively taking him out of the game, but he averaged 28.6% target rate weeks 1 to 4. And in his first 3 games, he was over 20 PPR points in all of those. So there's enough underlying statistics where I look at Christian Kirk and go, I'm willing to say last week was a blip. Let's see how this week goes. Because like you say, against the Colts in week 1, he had 17.7 PPR points. I think, the Colts on paper, they've allowed the second fewest fantasy points to receivers, but they rank 28th in DVOA versus wide receiver 1s. So it's like more that they're shutting down the secondary options. So It'd be very interesting to see how he gets on. But I think a lot of this comes back to Trevor Lawrence. In the first 3 weeks, he was averaging an 80.3% completion rate in clean pockets. And then the last 2 weeks, that's dropped down to like 57%. So he really needs to just, take a breath, remain calm. I think the Eagles game probably messed him up a bit because it's such a ferocious defensive line and the weather was bad, and he just needs to relax a little and get back to playing how he was to start the season.
Yeah, and if you look at Christian Kirk's routes, last week, he still ran 98% of the routes. His targets per route run was only 6%, which is not good at all. So I'm going to chalk this up to just a kind of a fluky week. And here's the good thing about Christian Kirk. I know people like to get crazy, like, oh, I got him in my lineup. He laid an egg for me. Christian Kirk was probably drafted as your wide receiver 3. You're not counting on him to be Devontae Adams or Justin Jefferson for your team. And he's wide receiver 20 right now in PPR. So if your third wide receiver is wide receiver 20, you're doing okay.
It's a good job.
Yeah. In LA, the Chargers are this enigma, right? They lose everybody to injury, and then they start winning games. So they were down multiple scores to the Browns last week before coming back to win 30-28. But here's the fun thing. They piled up 227 rushing yards, which led the NFL on the day. Austin Ekeler had 173 of them himself. He's rebounded nicely from a pretty slow start. And I hear people talking about the fact that he doesn't have a carry inside the 5. The Chargers have given those so far to Josh Kelly and Sony Michel. I don't know if that's a big deal or not, or if it's just total variance. Maybe they're just not there very often, and those attempts could come. But I'm not going to complain about a guy who's, about to put up 40 points in a week. I know you like Eckler's schedule coming up, so tell me your thoughts on Austin Ekeler and this Chargers offense.
Yeah, like you said, it's infuriating when you see those running backs coming out on the goal line. Somebody like Sony Michel, who's barely playing whatsoever. Joshua Kelly, he seems to have something about him. He really seems to be in a good place this year. But we Austin Ekeler signaled this was coming. He said on the offseason, he was like, one of those guys needs to step up. He's aware that he can't play every down for the rest of his career, or his career is going to be much, much shorter. So when you get 5 touchdowns in 2 games and he's combining for like 70 PPR points, you can live with it. It's fine. I mean, his target rate's slightly up on last year. Last year it was 15%. Now it's up to 17%. I think we've seen that in games that Keenan Allen's missed, he tends to absorb a little bit more of those near the line of scrimmage targets, and his targets jump without Allen from 6.0 to 6.8. In the next few games, he's playing the Broncos, Seahawks, and Falcons, and all of them bottom half teams in rush defense, DVOA. So I think you can be pretty confident in Ekeler going forward, and just have to hope that he stays injury free.
Josh Kelly is a name that should be on your mind. If you're going to the waiver wire, I always preach churning the bottom of your roster, picking up handcuff running backs, and the wire might look kind of bare these days. Joshua Kelly should be owned in way more leagues than he is. Played 38% of the snaps last week, 32% of the rushing attempts. He's a solid player, and they drafted him out of UCLA. They thought they were going to have a bigger role for him. He was a little slow off the mark. But if something, God forbid, were to happen to Austin Ekeler, Josh Kelly has a major role in front of him.
Definitely. I think he's somebody that, everybody kind of thought maybe Isaiah Spiller would be the running back to take that role this year. Yep. If you're looking back at best ball drafts, I mean, I know I didn't really draft any Joshua Kelly, but I've got plenty of teams that are languishing with with Isaiah Spiller wasting a bench spot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no question about it. Mike Williams. He's a top 10 receiver through 5 weeks, just as he was a year ago. Keenan Allen hopefully returns soon. Do you think Big Mike keeps up this pace, or is this kind of fluky?
I think, when Keenan Allen comes back, there'll probably be a slight regression from it. But he's had 3 games of over 10 targets already, and he only had 4 of them in the whole of 2021. So it's kind of like, the ceiling that you were drafting him for, you're already getting games out there. I think, we probably have to worry about like Keenan Allen's fitness, because it seems like he's already had one issue with his hamstring where he had a setback already. So perhaps it's a case where, as he's getting older, he's been very durable, but he's going to start to struggle more. I think, this weekend in particular, it's going to be a very tough matchup for Mike Williams. He's probably going to see a lot of coverage from Patrick Surtain, who I know a lot of my guys over at Football Outsiders have been talking about him as one of the very best cornerbacks in football at the minute. So this weekend, maybe temper expectations. I'll probably stay away from him in DFS matchups, but otherwise, I think Mike Williams has been giving you the kind of performances that you hoped for.
Talking today with Tom Strachan, Football Outsiders. Make sure you're following him at NFL_T_Strock. That is TST Rack. TST Rack. Think of it that way. Great stuff over at Football Outsiders. Appreciate him joining us today. You know what is not getting enough love in the fantasy community or the NFL community as a whole is this Raheem Moster comeback story. Here's a dude who gets his mail forwarded to the training room. He's always hurt, okay? Now all of a sudden he's blown past Chase Edmonds, and unless there's some weird thing going on with Chase Edmonds we don't know about, he's kind of droppable for fantasy. Mostert owns every role on this Dolphins team. He's at nearly 70% of Miami's rushing attempts, and now he's pushing 70% of their 2-minute work. So don't look now, but over the past 2 weeks, Mostert's a top 20 back, and the arrow keeps pointing up. Miami plays a pretty slow pace, and they're on their 3rd-string quarterback this week, but that just tells me, Tom, that Mostert should see a boatload of touches. So are you buying Mostert as a rest of the season RB2?
Yeah, I mean, it's always kind of a little difficult to project rest of season with running backs, but if you can get 4 or 5 games out of him, I'll take that absolutely for the price that it costs you to acquire him. I mean, I think Edmonds, it's just been really surprising how poor he's looked, whereas Moster, it's pleasantly surprising to see how well he's playing. It's just as bad to see Edmonds just, he gets hit at the line of scrimmage 39% of the time, whereas Moster, it's 31%. And it's fine to get hit at the line of scrimmage 39% of the time if you're efficient after contact. Guys like Derrick Henry get hit at the line of scrimmage all the time. Mm-hmm. But Chase Edmonds averages 1.8 yards per attempt after contact, whereas Moster, he averages 3.2. So he's got that burst. He gets away from people more often. And it's easy to see why the coaching staff prefer him over Edmonds. Like, in the last 2 weeks, Mostert's had 33 carries, whereas Edmonds had 6 in that time. So I think the writing's on the wall. You definitely cannot start Chase Edmonds anytime soon. There was a point early on in the season where it looked like Chase Edmonds might have this goal line role. He had 2 carries. I forget who it was against, maybe the Patriots or the Bengals, where he went in from like the 1 yard line. But even that doesn't seem to be happening week to week. So if you can't count on touchdowns, you can't count on volume. And if you can't count on the 2-minute work, then there's just nothing left to count on.
No. And in that same light, are we starting to add Myles Gaskin? 4 carries for 9 yards. Again, that ain't setting the world on fire, but we saw Gaskin a year ago. He had a role, and he was starting in fantasy lineups. So if they're going to kind of phase out Edmonds, who's making a ton of dough, are you telling people, hey, if you got a spot on the end of your bench, we know most can't stay healthy, maybe Myles Gaskin isn't the worst player to put a chip on?
I think for me, that kind of, a lot of that came last week when the game was kind of already blown out of proportions. And perhaps it was more of a case as they see it sending a message to Edmonds. It's saying, look, right, you're not playing well. This guy is getting rushes over you. Or maybe it's a case of they've got so much money tied up in Edmonds, they don't want to risk him in a situation like that, whereas Gaskin is probably seen as more expendable. So personally, I'm not picking up Myles Gaskin in redraft or anywhere. I think in Dynasty, he was somebody who ended up on a lot of waivers because he seemed to have been completely, thrown out of the toy room or whatever. And if you can pick him up in a deeper Dynasty league, I don't mind adding him there because you never know what might happen with injuries on other teams, and perhaps he ends up in a slightly bigger role. But he's not a player who really gets the juices flowing.
If you want to get your juices flowing because you like betting, but you don't like doing, the line, I don't know how to do the money line. I don't know what plus 140 means or minus 250. Maybe you just know fantasy football and you can say, I know how to bet who's going to score more fantasy points. Go download the Top Prop Fantasy app. Use promo code Drake and I'll match your first deposit up to $50. All you have to do, folks, download the app, go to their app was going to bring up a bunch of cards. It's going to say, who's going to score more points in this game? You think it's going to be, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes. Boom. You swipe one way or the other. That's it. That's all you got to do. Use promo code Drake. I'm on a heater over there. I'm like 14-4 on the season with my picks. You can follow along at Drake Fantasy on Twitter, and I'll give those out for every Island game Thursday and Monday. But again, Top Prop Fantasy Sports. Use promo code Drake, and I'll double your instant deposit up to $50. All right, I got to ask you this, Tom. What is your take on Taysom Hill? This guy's listed as a tight end in some formats, but he's playing quarterback, he's playing a wide receiver, he's playing anything that's not tight end. His snaps over the 2 weeks are rising, and the Saints team is struggling to find some juice on offense. So it makes sense to get Taysom Hill more involved. But here's the question for fantasy. If you added Hill, and we know tight end is a wasteland, do you play him knowing full well you could be risking getting a 0?
And that's exactly the question and kind of the problem that there's always been with Taysom Hill. I think, the way that his usage goes up and down so often is what frustrates fantasy managers as much as, he doesn't seem, 1 minute he's a QB, 1 minute he's a tight end, 1 minute he's playing in the backfield, then he's returning kicks. It's like fantasy managers like having something that you can build around, something concrete. And with Taysom Hill, it doesn't exist. Like, he's had 2 games with 80 or more rushing yards, and he's had 2 where he's had around 20. Yeah, like the plays which they're scripting for him, I think some people thought that without Sean Payton there, that he wouldn't get used in the same way and that he might have just been hanging around because the contract they gave him was so ludicrous. But like last week, you could see that the play went for 60 yards on. They had 9 offensive linemen or tight ends lined up on the line of scrimmage, another tight end in the backfield with him. And it just brought all the Seahawks defenders down into the box. And so once he got past the line of scrimmage, he had 1 player beat, and then he was away for 60 yards. It's like that kind of creativity and that kind of ability to turn a game quickly, it doesn't exist on every roster. I'm not sure. Like last week, I started Taysom Hill in 1 league where I was in dire straits, and it looked like a genius move.
Holy smokes!
Until Travis Kelce scored 4 touchdowns and the other manager beat me. But it's like I started Taysom Hill in week 2 when I needed a tight end in another league, and I think he got barely any points that week that I started him. So there's no way that I'd ever be able to say with confidence you should start Taysom Hill this week. I don't do fantasy rankings, but I pity anyone who's got to try and equate for Taysom Hill in fantasy rankings for the rest of the season. That's not going to be much fun at all.
No. Before I get you out of here, let me ask you about your favorite team, the Baltimore Ravens. Lamar Jackson is QB2 on the season. We've got J.K. Dobbins back, but it seems like they're really bringing him along slow. Rashad Bateman has a foot issue. We don't know if he's going to play. And it's, a team where they don't have a lot of weapons outside of Mark Andrews, who's a monster. So just what's the fantasy thought process here with the Baltimore Ravens? Are you in on Devin Duvernay? Is there anybody else we should be picking up? Do you like Kenyon Drake sort of as a low-end running back? Or we're just going to kind of wait and see and just in Lamar we trust?
Yeah, always in Lamar we trust. I'm very confident that he had a bad week against the Bengals, but I feel like he's going to bounce back. I do think, going back to what you said about Dobbins, I don't think this is the week to start him. The Ravens have already played the Jets, and John Harbaugh was quite critical of the turf at the stadium. He said that he really didn't like that. He thought there was some, he just made a sly few comments in the way that he didn't, I don't really want to talk about it, and then would say, yeah, it wasn't great. And already this week he's being asked about his views on it, and it just feels like if you're being cautious with injured players, somebody like J.K. Dobbins doesn't feel like you want to push him out there. Instead, maybe it is a week where Kenyon Drake gets more work, and Gus Edwards should be back soon. So maybe it's kind of like a last chance to really see whether Drake's worth holding around before they make a move to open up a roster spot for Gus Edwards. I think Devin Duvernay has been fantastic this year. In previous years, he's only really been doing the kick returns a bit, and he'd get the odd sort of play. But he's making strong contested catches, and one of Lamar's big developments this year is throwing better balls like that over the shoulder, and Duvernay's been bringing those down and been fighting for everything. So very much in on Duvernay. I think you can start him as a flex depending on the matchup and depending on your bye week situation throughout the rest of the season. I had hoped James Prochet was going to make a jump. He was the talk of camp, but he had a soft tissue injury that seems to have just stilted everything. Isaiah Likely was somebody that every day during the offseason I would just see numerous reports about him blowing up at camp. He blew up in preseason, and then it hasn't quite happened yet. So maybe he can get back involved. But right now, I think you've really just got to say it's Lamar, it's Andrews, it's Dobbins if you're at a push, and then it's Duvernay if you're at a push, and that's about it.
And it's the Fantasy Football Hustle. If that's where you're looking for some great intel to get your fantasy team to the next level. I want to thank Tom so much for taking the time to hang out with us today. Again, Tom Strachan is our guest. NFL_T Strock. That's where you find him over at the Football Outsiders, man. This was a good time. I'm looking forward to it. So what do you got going on the rest of the day? I know we had a big time difference here. I'm in New York and you're over in London. So is it time to get ready for bed or what's going on?
Yeah, so it's about 2:20 in the afternoon. So after this, I've got Fantasy Pros Weekend Waiver Wire Stash column to write, and then in another few hours after that, I've got the Football Outsiders Fantasy Sports Betting and DFS podcast, which we do every week and be on our YouTube channel. So Thursdays are busy, but yeah, it was
nice.
Great being on with you. Really appreciate you having me on.
Before we go, we got a couple of questions in the chat room here. My buddy Corey Richmond, big Browns fan, asks, would you trade for Devontae Adams with this news of a possible suspension around?
I think, if you can get him at a discount because of that, and if you got the strength to get through the next couple of weeks, or if you're out to like a 4-1 start or even a 3-2 start, and you think you can get by with depth, if you're getting Adams at a discount, I'd definitely be doing that because he looked great against the Chiefs.
Oh, I'm with you. Yeah, play on the fear that somebody might have. Another question, thoughts on Kyren Williams of the LA Rams role coming off of IR? We know he was supposed to have some kind of role on opening night. He gets hurt on the kickoff to start the season, and we don't see from him again. I've got him stashed on an IR here or there. That offense looks terrible. They need some juice. They can't run the ball at all. So maybe Kyren Williams is the answer.
No, I think that's a really smart play. It's something that, to be honest, it had passed me by. I hadn't realized he was coming off IR, but it just seems like Sean McVay is, he wants it to be Cam Akers, but Cam Akers just can't take control of that job. Darrell Henderson, he flashes at times, but there's no consistency either. And if Rams like Kyron Williams as much as they said they do, then it's a low opportunity cost to be able to keep him stashed on your bench. And if it turns into something great, then it could be a real league winner.
Absolutely. And if you want a league winner on YouTube, it's got to be the Fantasy Football Hustle channel. Like it, comment, subscribe, help us out over there. It's a major, major bonus for us if you interact with the show here on YouTube. And of course, if you're listening on iTunes, leave us a 5-star review. Say hello. Say, hey, we like what you guys are doing over there on the Hustle. We appreciate it. So, Tom, thanks so much, my friend. Enjoy your day. Enjoy the 58 other podcasts you have to do today and articles. And everybody, again, make sure you're following Tom on Twitter at NFL_TStrack. I am Brian Drake for The Hustle. We'll see you guys next week. And remember to never get out hustle.